Welcome, everyone, to another chapter in the Dayton Literary Peace Prize series, Turn the Page. Tonight's event is titled Caste, Class, Race, and Bias, Understanding and Challenging Our Social Hierarchy. My name is Gilbert King, and I'm on the advisory board of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and have been known to serve as Master of Ceremonies at the award ceremony in pre-pandemic times. I'm also an author who writes about race and criminal justice, so I could not be more excited to be moderating a conversation with two brilliant authors I'd like to introduce you to in a moment. But first, just want to say the Dayton Literary Peace Prize would like to thank its partner, the New American Colleges and Universities, a national consortium of private institutions working together to graduate extraordinary professionals for a global workforce and society. I extend a warm welcome to the faculty, staff, and students joining us from NACU campuses around the nation. We are excited to collaborate with NACU on this event, and hopefully you'll have more opportunities to work together in the future. One little announcement: on October 14th, the author Ya Jesse will be in Dayton speaking about homegoing and other topics, obviously. You can go to the Dayton Literary Peace Prize website for details about that event. It's in Dayton, and that's October 14th. I'm going to start with some introductions. We'll start with Dr. Eberhardt. Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt is a professor of psychology at Stanford and a recipient of the 2014 MacArthur Genius Grant. She has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and was named one of Foreign Policy's 100 leading global thinkers. She is a co-founder and co-director of SPARK, Social Psychological Answers to Real-World Questions, a Stanford center that brings together researchers and practitioners to address significant social problems. Her book, Biased: Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do, was the Nonfiction Runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in 2020. Welcome, Dr. Eberhardt.
Thank you.
Isabel Wilkerson, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Humanities Medal, has become a leading figure in narrative nonfiction, an interpreter of the human condition, and an impassioned voice for demonstrating how history can help us understand ourselves, our country, and our current era of upheaval. Her debut work, The Warmth of Other Suns, won the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Heartland Prize for Nonfiction, the Anisfield Wolf Award for Nonfiction, the Linton History Prize from Harvard and Columbia Universities, and the Stephen Ambrose Oral History Prize, and was shortlisted for the Penn Galbraith Literary Award. And we can't forget she was nonfiction winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in 2011. Her new book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents, is a #1 New York Times bestseller, and it's also a finalist for the 2021 Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Welcome, Isabel.
Hello, so good to be with you.
Oh, this is going to be fun. Thanks so much for coming tonight. I'll just explain. Tonight I have some questions that we have prepared with some very dedicated readers from the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, but we definitely want you in the virtual audience to contribute questions of your own. If you move your cursor to the bottom right part of the screen, you'll see a Q&A button. And you can use that at any time during this conversation to ask a question. Toward the end, I'll be going into that Q&A and bring some of those questions to our authors. So let's start the discussion, and we'll start with Isabel. The term caste may be new for a number of readers, at least in context with the US. Could you define it and explain how it connects or overlaps with the term racism, which most of us are more familiar with?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I came to the language of caste through the first book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which, of course, I was so thrilled to be brought into the Dayton Literary Peace Prize fold with that book. So I came to the use of that term because I spent a tremendous amount of time. I spent 15 years on that book. Often say if it were a human being, it would be in high school and dating. That's how long it took me to finish that book. But I came to that word. I mean, just like other Americans, it's not language that I would have associated with our country. But in doing the research and spending time with people who were survivors of Jim Crow in order to tell the story of the Great Migration, had to talk about what was the world that they were defecting, what was the world that they were seeking political asylum away from. And in order to do that, I spent so much time talking with them. and then also trying to recreate that era. And in doing so, I had to go and also look into the works of those brave social scientists, those brave anthropologists who went into the Jim Crow South in the 1930s and 40s when that regime was at its peak power, and they risked their lives in order to document the framework, the hierarchy, the structure of that world, and they emerged from their research using the language of caste. And so that's language that I adopted as well, because it seemed as if it were the more comprehensive way of getting us to recognize how very rigid, how very controlled, how very hierarchical, how very embedded, and how very strictly enforced that world was, reminding ourselves that it was a world in which it was against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. You could go to jail if you were caught playing checkers with a person of a different race. This was a world in which the very word of God, the Bible, was segregated in courtrooms throughout the South. There was actually a Black Bible and an altogether separate white Bible to swear to tell the truth on in court. The same sacred object could not be touched by hands of different races. So that's a tremendous level of effort in reinforcement and enforcement that was implemented in order to maintain strict lines of hierarchy in that world. And the idea of not being able to touch the same sacred object is one of the hallmarks of a caste system in which there is such this belief in purity versus pollution, so that in other ancient hierarchies and caste systems, that's one of the main pillars of a caste system. And so it was tightly regulated in the Jim Crow South. And so that's how I came to use that language, because it seemed to be more comprehensive in capturing the depth and the level of investment and policing of boundaries in that society. It literally was a matter of life and death. You could lose your life for some breach of that caste system. In fact, every 3 days, an African-American was killed for some breach of the caste system in the early decades of the 20th century. And so caste essentially is an arbitrary, artificial, graded ranking of human value in a society. It's what determines one's standing, one's benefit of the doubt, respect that is accorded a person, one's access to resources or the denial of access to resources, assumptions of competence and worthiness and intelligence. All of these having nothing to do with anything that we as individuals might have done, but having been born into a pre-existing 400-year-old social order in which everything that a person was perceived as being able to do, literally whether you could own property or be property, was determined by your categorization in the originating hierarchy of our country that was designed by the colonists, along the Chesapeake before there was a United States of America. And so that is, in a nutshell, what caste is.
Wow, that's a great answer. I think some of the topics will jump around a little bit, but they really do overlap in a lot of ways. So I'll start out with Jennifer. In your book, you explain implicit bias, and you write it this way. Quote, implicit bias is not a new way of calling someone a racist. In fact, you don't have to be a racist at all to be influenced by it. Implicit bias is a kind of distorting lens that's a product of both the architecture of our brain and the disparities in our society. So the question is, what is implicit bias? Do we all manifest it? Is it possible to educate ourselves to the point where our actions do not reflect it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Oftentimes, I'm a social psychologist. In social psychology, we define bias as something, it's your perceptions and your attitudes that can influence decision-making and actions, even when you're not aware of it. So we create categories to make sense of the world, to assert some kind of coherence and control over the stimuli that we're bombarded with constantly. And we do this by instinctively relating on, kind of relying on, I guess, patterns that seem predictable. And so we're finding, though, that just as these categories that we're creating help us, just to move through the world and to make split-second decisions and help us to sort of comprehend things in a really efficient way, they also reinforce bias. So the very, abilities that help us to see the world are the same things that can help us to blind us to that world. And in terms of sort of how do you address that, I think, there's a way in which, you can address that with the opposite force. So as we're being quick and efficient, and we're trying to rely on things instinctively, we're using sort of automatic processes to comprehend the world, we can combat that in certain circumstances with friction, by slowing down, by using a sort of a different part of the brain, if you will, by interrogating where the categories came from, by trying to understand, the history of the associations that are brought forth, and so forth.
Yeah, and this is something that actually a question that I think both of you would be interesting if both of you would tackle. For a caste system or systemic racism to be embedded in a society, is it necessary for it to be codified into law? How important is the legal system in the internalization of racism in a society? Can racism or a caste system exist without a legal system behind it? And Isabel, if you wanted to start with that one.
Well, the subtitle of my book is The Origins of Our Discontents. And one of the reasons why that actually was a working title for this book the entire time I was working on it. And that had to do with the fact that I was trying to understand, where did this all begin? How far back do we have to go to understand how we arrived at the state in which we happen to be now? How were these divisions encoded into our society? And in doing so, what you learn is that this was not an overnight project. I mean, this took decades and decades in order to codify, to establish who could do what in the colonies, to establish who could marry whom, to establish to actually define what race was. So this was essentially what the 17th century in colonial Virginia and Maryland were about. And in doing so, when we look at that, we realize that the laws were created in order to establish the hierarchy, the infrastructure of our society. And then over time, with being in place for as long as it has been, it turns out that actually, with or without the laws, speaking to Jennifer's incredible work, it's these unconscious biases that keep them going. So that they're with or without the laws, these assumptions and stereotypes, biases and actions can occur. The policing of the boundaries, the autonomic assumptions about who belongs where, who should be doing what in society, can then exist without any laws at all. In other words, many of the things that have occurred, for example, what happened to George Floyd was against the law. I mean, it was against the law, and his assailant, was tried. But those things occur in spite of the fact that there are laws, either protecting against these things or laws that were in place that established the divisions to begin with. One of the quotes that stays with me when it comes to this question about laws versus attitudes, laws versus behavior, is basically I'm trying to paraphrase the words of Stephen Biko, who said something along the lines of the greatest weapon of an oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So that even without the laws, without the codification, which was, of course, the basis for the divisions to begin with. But once that's set in motion, once people, speaking of Jennifer's work, once people have absorbed the messaging, once people have assumed and have built into themselves these biases that they're not even aware of, that are unconscious, implicit, and split-second assumptions that are being made before the conscious mind can even process it, then that is where, that's where it continues on with or without the laws. And that's why this is such an intractable, long-standing problem, because it, as Jennifer was saying, it doesn't require that a person be or present themselves as racist. It means that people have been programmed to see the world and see others in that world in a particular way.
You have anything to add on to that, Jennifer?
Yeah, I not much to add. I think Isabel said it all. I agree entirely with what she said. I think that's also the mistake that we keep making in this country, that we can, change a law or change a policy and that will fix everything. And we keep getting shocked by the fact that, these things just sort of transform in a way where we're still dealing with it. And we still have ways of reinforcing inequality and so forth. And so I just feel like I don't feel hopeless, about it, but I feel like this is one of those things that requires constant vigilance. We can't just sort of say our work is done, after we, make some progress or we have a movement or we change a law. We have to actually, it's not gone. So we have to, just be vigilant to, how it resurfaces and be ready to address it in other ways.
This is another kind of question that's sort of jumping for both of you. Your books are scholarly, but they tell human stories, often brutal, inhumane stories of operations being performed on women and babies without anesthesia, or the brutality of the murder of Black men in the streets. Can you tell a convincing story of racism without telling the horrific stories of dehumanization that are the result of racism or a caste system? How important is it to include inhumane actions of white supremacy or higher caste to the reader's understanding the cruelty of the system? Anybody wants to start on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's critical to actually have the stories there. I think without the stories, we could fool ourselves into believing that it's something of the past or it's not a big deal, that it's not horrific. I think the voyeurism comes from watching atrocities with no critique of them and sort of drinking it in with no sort of understanding about what's going on. So I think that's a problem. And I also feel like when we're shielding ourselves from the horrors of all of this, that there's a way in which it doesn't respect the people who are the recipients or the targets of it. It doesn't really take in their pain. It doesn't really, and in some ways, that the not showing this it could be a way of dehumanizing the targets of it.
Mm. And it's interesting because I was going to say, Isabel, in one instance, when you're writing about history and torture, you say that there are stories too grisly to share. I'm just wondering, where do you draw that line, jumping off of what Jennifer just said?
Yeah, well, I want to first say that I completely agree with what Jennifer said, particularly when it comes to the current era in which we have technology that allows us to capture brutality as it's occurring, remembering that those of us alive today literally saw a man killed before our very eyes, George Floyd. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. We all saw this. People around the world saw that. The videos are available on YouTube. That means that we are still exposed to and having to process a person killed before our very eyes, something that the majority of human beings never ever see unless they're soldiers. And we have to remember that what this is doing is it can potentially numb us to the dehumanization of people who have been subjugated in our society. It's a form of dehumanization to have these videos out there, as Jennifer was saying, without critique, without context. And to tell you the truth, actually out there at all. I mean, for other groups of people, these videos do not remain up in the public sphere out of respect for the final moments of a human being, a member of our own species, the final moments of that person being on this planet. And I think that we need to interrogate and question and recognize the damage that this does both to us as people who can grow numb to the violence against other people, against people in our society, and particularly those who have been born to subjugation in this society, but then also how it is disrespectful. It is not in keeping with honoring those who suffer. So as for the decisions that have to be made in the writing process, as we are tasked with telling a history, describing a history of what our country's been through. So the work that I do and that I know that you do as well, Gilbert, is I call it narrative nonfiction. I'm assuming that's what you call it too.
That's exactly what I
but
call
narrative nonfiction means, yeah, exactly. So one of the essential rules of narrative nonfiction is to show and not tell. Yeah. So I could tell you that it was a brutal era, that slavery was inhumane. I could say that over and over again. But what we do in this work is to show rather than tell. That's the whole purpose of what we do. And it takes a tremendous amount of research and time to do that. And in doing so, I think it's important to recognize that since many of us, and I hear about this all the time, many Americans have not had the chance to know our country's true history. We may not have learned this in school. I mean, much of this is not taught. I mean, when you think of your book, that people who knew about the case of the Groveland case. I mean, who knew about that? And the work that I do, I hear from people all the time who read my work and they'll say, I had no idea. I had no idea this happened in our country. I had no idea it happened in, say, for some people in their lifetime. I had no idea it happened in my part of the country. I mean, people just say they had no idea. And by not having an idea, not having an idea has consequences. And the only reason people don't have an idea is because it's not being taught. It's not something that has been established, even though it's easily documented, but it is there. And so I think that it's absolutely necessary to wake ourselves from the assumptions of what we tend to recognize as exceptionalism among ourselves, and to recognize that no, there are really, there was a tremendous amount of brutality that occurred in the making of our country. And we owe it to ourselves to know exactly how it came to be. But to Jennifer's point as well, I mean, it's something that I think about all the time. And one of the things that inspires me in the work that I do is that I happen to be the descendant of people whose faces I will never know, whose names I will never know. And these are people who somehow survived the Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean against their will, to face an uncertain and horrific, multi-generational condemnation to enslavement. And those stories, all of those stories cannot fully, truly be known, but those that we do know of, they deserve to be told. We as Americans deserve to know what happened in our country to make our country what it is, the sacrifices that were made for our country to exist. And I would say that, in the process of working on this, sometimes I get asked, how do you get through it? I mean, some of this is so difficult. And one of the things that I say is that if the people could endure what they endured, and again, Americans really truly need to know what happened in this country. But if they could endure what they did, the atrocities that occurred in this country, then surely I can take the time to study it and to research it and to write about it. And if I could take the many, many years that it takes to research and to synthesize and to write about it, then that means that other Americans, other readers, can surely take the time to learn about this as well. These are things that give honor to the people who suffered in ways that that are almost unimaginable. We owe a debt to what they suffered, and we owe it to ourselves to know what happened to them. Not knowing is a disservice and disrespectful to people who suffered in this country for hundreds of years.
Yeah, I mean, you both made such great points about this. And, one of the things that I go around and speak and talk, and one of the things that I am told is exactly what you just said, Isabel. I had no idea this was happening in this country. That is like so common every time I talk about these things. And I think there is a reason that we don't know, is because we look at the textbooks and we see Jim Crow pictured as just a photograph of separate water fountains. And then we move on to another era, the civil rights era, where Martin Luther King came and fixed all that. And we don't know the true story. And when you start learning the true story, this is why your storytelling is so important in telling these stories and making sure that people are aware of what was really happening in this country. So those were two excellent answers.
And making them, I'm sorry, just making them aware of what's happening now. So, I mean, we started talking about George Floyd. There were, lots of marches across the country, across the world. There were sort of multi-generational marches, multiracial marches, and so forth. But I conducted a study with some colleagues at Stanford, and we were interested actually in how parents, talk about race to their children. And we happened to collect that data just a few weeks before George Floyd's death. And then we decided to collect it again, afterwards, after his death, to see if those conversations were changing at all. And we found that, African Americans, they talk about race, to their children. They share stories. They prepare them for the world that we're living in now. They talk to them about what the world used to be like, all of those things. And even more so after George Floyd's death, they were a lot more likely to talk about, to their children, talk about racial inequality, to talk about Black identity. And they were also more worried that their child would be a target of bias. And so you see all these effects, happening around Floyd's death, parents responding by trying to protect their children and their family. We didn't see much of a change at all with white parents. Post George Floyd, they weren't talking to their children more, about race. In fact, they talked to their children less about white identity. They did talk to children more about color blindness, and this idea that we're all the same and that color doesn't matter. And so I feel like not just the historical moments, but the moments that we are living through now aren't sort of being processed, evenly or in the same way or even deeply, right? And so I think we should also interrogate that, and that gets back to the question you posed initially, which was about the voyeurism. When you actually are just faced with the image and there's no interrogation, then it is more like voyeurism than it is respect for that life that was taken, and a true sort of understanding of how race is lived in this country.
Wow. Thank you very much. That was excellent. Another question for both of you can tackle. You both share the hope that we can rise above caste and racial inequity to find justice. Could you give us your pathway to a social structure that reflects respect and acceptance? What can we as readers, as individuals, do to begin to be more conscious of behaviors that result in racism and bias?
So I don't know if you want to start, Isabel.
Oh, anybody can start.
I feel like we're moving to the solutions before we've really dealt with all the problems first. Yeah. It's kind of quick. I'd actually like to hear more from Isabel about just you're an incredible writer, I should say. Everyone knows that. And I feel like you write in a way where people have access to information that they couldn't really process before. And I think this is the power of the written word is something I guess we can do to help people to just see. I think that so much of what's happening now and what happened before, we don't really have access to it because we don't have the narratives in society that kind of support that vision on it and support the discussions that we need to be having about it.
Well, Jennifer, I want to say thank you. I so appreciate it. It means so much to me to hear those words from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Actually, you bring up a very good point. Let's start with caste for a second. Caste focuses on the invisible and self-perpetuating social structures, the caste systems that ensure social stratification along lines demarcated by skin color in the US, historical social relations, India, or ethnic nationalism, Nazi Germany, that help to perpetuate the very visible acts of racial prejudice we see playing out almost daily in the news. Bias focuses more on ingrained ways of thinking passed on through culture and family that perpetuate racist thinking and acting. So I have to assume that you're both familiar with each other's work. It sounds like we are here.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could both comment on this chicken and egg relationship between social structures and learned behaviors in maintaining the status quo, and how one goes about unpacking that relationship between social structures and learned behaviors.
Well,
Go
go ahead.
No, you go ahead first.
Well, I would say, as I had said before, I mean, the legal framework of our society, the legal, social, political framework of our society was in place and has been in place for 400 years, and it predated the biases that would naturally grow. I mean, actually, this was the natural outcome of the hierarchical framework that was created in our society going back to the 17th century. And so, which came first, people had to be told that they were a different category before the transatlantic slave trade, before the European expansionism of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. There was no need to have the categories, the artificial man-made categories of race that we've grown to accept as the received wisdom of the ages. I mean, before the transatlantic slave trade and European expansionism, there was no need for someone who was Irish or Polish to identify themselves as white. I mean, that's a social construct that was a creation of human beings in the manufacture of the society that we live in now, and we've lived with it for so long that now we view this as some primordial existential truth, when in fact this is a social construct. It's a creation of human beings. And as I look at our situation, I mean, I think of us as the structure and the behaviors reinforce each other. Right. And what I would say is, what I describe as a caste system or a hierarchy, or the framework, the infrastructure of our divisions, can only be maintained by human beings. So the structure is there. And then it's the human beings, it's the human behavior, the human response to the programming that keeps it going. In the same way we're saying, you don't even need laws now in order to do this. And I wanted to give one example that stays with me so much. I mean, in the last few years, we've seen so many examples of African Americans going about their lives, and then someone intrudes upon their life, calls the police on them, whether they're sitting at a Starbucks waiting for a friend, if they're barbecuing at a park in Oakland. There's this one gentleman, a businessman, who was merely trying to get into his condo building in St. Louis. He was coming home from work. He was dressed in that way. He was, putting the key into the lobby to try to get in. And there was a woman, happened to be a white woman, who was there at the front, and someone who lived there, and she blocked him from being able to get into his own building. And she demanded to know who he was, demanded to know where he lived, demanded to know. She said she hadn't seen him before. I don't believe you don't belong here, which is one of the sort of a code word for caste, meaning you are stepping out of your place. You're beyond your place, which is a language that was very common in the Jim Crow South. This woman literally blocked him from getting into his own building. And then it wasn't a matter of fear. When we think of fear, racism, and that sort of thing, this was her policing and surveilling him. She actually followed him to the elevator, rode up with him on the elevator. So she was not afraid of him. She continued to demand to know if he lived there, what was he doing there, why was he there? And then she followed him, got off the elevator with him on the floor where he lived. And the video, which he was taking to protect himself, because in the society in which we live, historically, black men could face, it could be endangered if she were to call the police. And then he was recording this. And so she followed him all the way to the point that he put the key in the door in his own apartment and closed the door. And that's when the video ends. She was following him in a way of policing the boundaries of that have been long established and so deeply encoded into the subconsciouses of virtually every American, that she was responding to her perceived role as surveilling him. And this speaks to the ways in which there's the structure, and then there's the enforcement of the structure by any number of people who could rise up to present themselves as policing the boundaries that have been established for generations.
Yeah, I guess I could tell a story too, actually, about someone who was, the job was to be the reinforcer or to police boundaries. And this is a story about a police officer that I met once. And he told me a story. He was German, and he told me a story about, coming to the United States. And as soon after he got here, he joined the police force somewhere. And he told me about sort of hearing the suspect descriptions blaring from the cruiser radio day after day. So the dispatcher would say, male black, male black, male black. That's is what he heard all day long during his many hour shift, and every day of the week, every week of the year, and so forth. And even when he said he would try to turn the radio down because maybe that call had nothing to do with him. He's in a different part of the city, but then he would still hear it, day after day in the background, right? Male black, male black. And so there was a way in which that suspect description was one, where he felt like he was primed to act on it after a certain time. So it started to dictate where he looked. So there was this association that was forming in his mind between, black men and crime. And so he would start to look at black men, and he would look to see where their hands were. He would, search for their hands. He would see them on the street, and he would look at how they move their bodies, and, trying to figure out if the movement was furtive, if, all of these things. And so it was this sort of instinctively, he within months, right, he began to associate, blackness with the threat. And so he was kind of witnessing the reshaping of his mind to fit with American society and sort of how we, like how people are equipped here in that same way. And so he became a carrier of bias, but also an enforcer of the American caste system, right, at the same time. And he was figuring out and he was understanding the association, but also figuring out where he fit within the system, within the world we're living here in the States. And so it was just it was eye-opening for me to, we talk about children and where they learn bias, how they learn bias all the time. And I just thought it was this interesting that he could feel the change, and he felt like he couldn't even block the change, right? He couldn't. It was just sort of just being in the environment was changing how he saw the world, what he saw, and how he interpreted what he saw.
Mm.
I would also add that, we are bombarded. We're bombarded as a society with the messaging that you're speaking about.
Yeah.
When you think about from, billboards to television shows to, to music videos to who gets killed first in a horror movie or we know we are trained
Yeah.
to perceive who is on top and who is to be in which kind of subservient roles. I spent a lot of time with Caste, looking at the representation of people in film, for example, and of Black women. There was a case of Louise Beavers who was so restricted in what she could do as an actress, and that was because they were using her merely as a foil to elevate whoever was the white ingenue who was the star of the movie. And they would do such things as of course, she would have the head rags on. She was told to speak in a certain way. She actually had been raised in California, so she didn't have the Southern slave accent, but they would insist that she speak in that way. She had to kind of learn how to speak in that way. And then it turned out that she was under so much stress because of the ways in which they were cordoning her off into a certain kind of stereotypical role that was, of course, reinforcing caste. It was almost like film of that era became the curriculum for how we were to see ourselves, see each other. And she was under so much stress that she actually would begin losing weight on these sets. And then they would pad her in order to have her be even more distinctively in opposition to the slender ingenue who was the star. So these are ways in which, our society has, over the course of centuries, established and then reinforced who belongs where, who can do what, the stereotypes and assumptions that we live with to this day. And so you were talking about how this German immigrant was bombarded with, in a very particular way, but he could just turn on the television and also see it as well. So it's everywhere.
It is. It is, and it's not just the media, it's us, right? I remember, I'll never forget this. My son, he was in first grade at the time, and he asked me if people saw Black people a different kind of way. And I said, well, what do you mean? He says, well, I just feel like there's something there. And he said, it's just something extra special. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he says, well, I don't know. And I said, well, think of an example. And he thought about it and he says, remember we were at the grocery store the other day, and he said there was a Black man who walked into the grocery store, and he said when he walked in, it was like there was a giant force field around him. He was really into Star Wars then, and so he said, yeah, it was like a giant force field, and everybody kind of stayed away from him. They were far away from him. And when he got into the line, his was the shortest line for the longest time. And I said, well, what do you think that means? And he says, I don't know. Again, he's first grader and he's thinking about it. And I said, well, think about it. And he thought, and he looked up at me and he said, I think it's fear. And I thought, wow.
Wow.
It was just amazing. And I thought, it just went right to the heart of it. Like, he's a first grader can figure that out, not from the movies, just from watching how we move in the world and how we respond to one another. And that's what kids do. Their job is to figure out, sort of what correlates with what goes with what. That's what he was doing. He was seeing these connections between Blackness and this kind of response. And there's a lot that's picked up from, how we how we interact with each other, how we respond to each other. And you don't even need the cartoons, you don't need the movies, you don't need the radio, just us and a careful examination of what we're doing and how we are moving communicates exactly what the kids are feeling they need to know.
Absolutely.
Wow. Uh, Isabel, one of the surprising revelations in caste was how the Nazis studied and borrowed from America's maintenance of its own caste system in order to erect and naturalize their own system of caste, that they regarded our caste system as, in some ways, a master plan. Of course, as you know, America still maintains this caste system, although its expression has modified over time, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Does this mean that our American caste system is as enduring as the Indian caste system?
Wow, well, that's a very in-depth question, a very amazing question. Let me start with Germany first. In synthesizing, the sort of the universal, perhaps, impulse to rank and to categorize people and create hierarchy, and looking at how we can better understand our own society. I wanted to look at Germany primarily because that's a country that has been forced to and has risen up to address, seek to atone, seek to make amends, and seek to interrogate their history. And in doing so, I actually went there looking to see what could we learn from how they have adjusted their society, adjusted their education system, adjusted their monuments and symbolism. What have they done, and what could we learn from that? But before I could even get to that, I was looking at the history of the Third Reich, and I had no idea that it turned out that German eugenicists were in dialogue with American eugenicists in the years leading up to the Third Reich. I had no idea about that. I hadn't thought of it, but I had no idea. And it turned out that the Nazis had actually sent researchers to the United States to study American jurisprudence, to study how the United States had managed to come up with a definition for what is a social construct, meaning race. They wanted to look at how the United States had created laws that controlled who could marry whom, these anti-miscegenation laws, and what were the rules and parameters of that. They wanted to understand how was it that the United States came up with a definition of who was Black and who was white. And it turned out that, of course, they needed no one to teach them how to hate. They absolutely needed no one to teach them how to hate. They came here looking for ways to build upon what they already were wishing to do, and to find a presumably acceptable, respectable way in order to create laws, to create ultimately the Nuremberg laws. And so, but it turned out in the process of doing that, they actually rejected the one drop rule. I mean, that was seen as, from their perspective, it was too extreme, which is just stunning, gut wrenching to recognize. And so their society, of course, it was a 12-year reign of the Nazis. They ended up taking it in a completely different direction, but they obviously, as we so well know, horrors that occurred. But in the decades since that time, one of the things many things they've done, but one of them is that they have made sure that young people there learn the history. They have made sure that from the earliest ages, they begin to learn what happened during the war. They have converted the places of horror into places of learning. They converted the place where the final solution was voted upon, the Wannsee estate. They've converted that into a museum where people can go and soberly interrogate, soberly confront the horrors there. And then in the middle of Berlin, a major world city, there is a massive, massive installation, and it is the monument to those who perished in the Holocaust. There are no monuments whatsoever to those who were the perpetrators of this. There are no monuments to the oppressors in that situation. All of the monuments are to those who perished or who suffered under that regime. And what's interesting about the Berlin monument is it takes up several football fields in the middle of a major world city. But one thing that's distinctive about it is there's no signage. There are no walls of exhibition language and text to describe what it is, because the people know why it's there. everyone knows why it's there. Everyone knows what it represents. That doesn't mean that they agree on everything. They just had an election that was very, very close. So it doesn't mean that everything is perfect and that they agree on everything. But one of the things is that they're all on the same page about what happened in that country. They recognize and know the history. And that's an example of how we have a long way to go in order to get to that point of critical recognition of what we've been through as a country.
Hmm.
And when you don't know the history, you also don't understand the current inequality in our country. It kind of leads you into a direction where you're sort of thinking about, groups that are in the lower caste, that they're deserving of that caste, right? That from their own choices and their own life circumstances that were in their control, they deserve to be there. And so without any understanding of history, we don't understand how inequality gets made in our country and who's affected by it and who's positioned where. I think, that's so in some ways that's a way in which you can, promote bias, right? Where you see inequality and you have no history to tag it to. You have no understanding of how it comes about. And in American society, it's right. It's all about independence and it's all about choice and it's all about sort of making your own way. And so as children even absorb that, they are also coming to some understanding about how to feel about people who are without, or people who they feel are beneath them, or people who are targets of discrimination and racism and so forth.
I completely agree. I would add that one of the ways that I like to look at it, to pick up on your point, Jennifer, is that we as Americans are like people who walked into a movie theater in the middle of a movie, and there on the screen we see a bus chasing a car, chasing a motorcycle. And we don't know, why is this bus chasing this car that's chasing a motorcycle? And we could watch to the end of the movie and still not really understand why the bus is chasing the car that's chasing the motorcycle. And you have to go all the way back and watch the movie from the very beginning. And then, and only then, do you really understand what was going on. Then you have a context for it. The story begins to make sense, and everything that happens after the moment that you walked into the theater suddenly clicks into place and you can understand it better. And that's essentially what history is. History is what happened in the movie before you walked into the theater. And unless you have that understanding, nothing will really truly make sense. And it's, when you think about it, it's actually quite sobering to think about all the decisions that are made in our society, how people vote, how people, where people choose to invest, where people choose to live, send their children to school, where they, who they choose to hire and who they choose to, who they will grant a mortgage to. It is stunning that so many of these decisions are being made with limited information about how our country came to be and how we find ourselves in the situation and how these inequalities were built into the system from the very beginning. And yet people are making decisions in isolation and out of context from what we actually have inherited. So this is one way of looking at it. And I completely agree with you. And your
I agree with you too.
I agree with both of you. I tell you, listening and reading your work has just really opened up my eyes to things that I sort of felt like I was already had open eyes to, but they've made me think about things differently. And I'm just listening to the story about your journeys to Germany, and I recalled a case or a story in Florida back during the World War II, where in Lake County that I was writing about, they had a POW camp for captured Nazis, and they brought them to Florida, and they loved it. They couldn't, they didn't want to go back. This was heaven for them. But as they sort of became more freer and more given more liberties in Florida, they were actually taken to movie theaters And the Nazis got to sit in the lower level where African Americans were still relegated to the Jim Crow section.
Wow.
And you just see, as they're working in the citrus fields, the Nazis get more powerful, more privileged. And it's shocking to think about. Having listened to you now, go back and read those accounts again, because that was just it's just staggering to me.
What you're saying is that what I describe as caste, or we could describe as race, actually overrode the fact that these were considered to be enemy combatants. Right. I mean, that was more important, that one's identity, the category to which one has been assigned, actually had primacy over the fact that these were presumed enemies of the state.
Right. Yeah, and that's absolutely staggering.
That actual citizens, and I should add, I'm sure that, we're all aware too, that many African-American soldiers and veterans had to confront that inequity. These are people who were risking their lives for our country, and they were treated worse than the German POWs that they might have, for whatever reason, been in the same space with. That they were treated differently, treated worse, treated as beneath them, because in a caste order, they were.
Right. Jennifer, your consulting and training work and the studies and personal anecdotes and bias frequently touch on how we read faces. As a girl who transferred to a majority white school, for example, you relate that you had trouble telling your classmates apart, even while they were very friendly and welcoming to you. Mm-hmm. This helps frame your later accounts of how, for example, police officers read the black face or body language through various filters, or how actors play off each other, or even how your young son absorbed notions of blackness and criminality. Can you talk about a bit about perceptual habits people need to be aware of?
Yeah. Where could I start?
Pick any part that you want to address.
Okay. So I guess I can just say that perceptual habits, they're passed down to us by our culture, and they can come to shape us, with or without our permission, in some ways. I think, so you mentioned the sort of the interactions between police and community members. I've done a fair bit of work on that, looking at the camera, this time in a different way from the motion pictures and all of that, but looking at the body-worn cameras that police officers have, and trying to use the camera as a tool to help us to understand how these interactions unfold. And so I've, for example, with a number of colleagues, we've looked at, over, 1,000 interactions in Oakland, California. And we chose to look at the most common form of contact. That's the traffic stop. And that traffic stop has a certain rhythm to it. There's certain things that both the officer and the community member kind of they expect, and there's a script for it almost, right? That you stop the car and you enter the officer will introduce himself or herself, state the reason for the stop. You ask for information, documents, right? And then either you're given a ticket or not. So there's a whole script. But even within that script, we were finding that there are real differences that seem subtle, like subtle differences at first that happen, even though everybody knows the script, right? So we found, for example, that even when officers were behaving completely professionally, they spoke to Black drivers with less respect than white drivers. So they, with white drivers, they would introduce themselves and they would say, sir or ma'am. Black drivers, they would use sometimes bro and dude. And so that those kinds of informal titles, they also were concerned for the safety, of white drivers more so so than Black drivers, or they expressed that concern more so. They offered more reassurance, to white drivers. They said it'll be okay, it'll be all right, and they helped them sort of navigate the whole thing. Black drivers, you're more likely to just, get the ticket, without the hand holding as much, or the reassurance as much. So it seems like subtle things, but it's a site where identity gets made. It's a site where I think Isabel would agree, where caste is kind of happening, right? This is the stage, on which this is all unfolding, and understanding, sort of what your status is in the country, and it determines to some extent how you're spoken to and how that conversation goes. We find that even with the tone of voice, you can there are techniques we can use to block the actual words that officers are saying. So it sounds like you're hearing someone talk on the other side of the door, and you can't hear what they're saying, but you hear the tone. And we find that the tones directed at Black drivers are more negative. They're less respectful. They talk down to Black drivers more. And even when we play these tones that are directed at Black drivers to people, we can play them to white people and to Black people. They all agree that they're less respectful, white, and it's a way of putting white drivers into the shoes of Black drivers in a way. And so they agree that they're less respectful, and it affects how they see the police department as a whole. So it's not just about the treatment from that particular officer, but it affects how you're seeing the department, the institution, the policing industry, sometimes. So it's it sounds like like they're just like these tiny ways that shouldn't matter so much, but these are the sort of elements that kind of I feel like when you put them all together, they help to reinforce caste, basically. And anyways, I could go on and on about that, but also even connecting it, to George Floyd. I'd say we see the same, kind of pattern. So for example, we know, and we work with a lot of different police departments now, and we can see that there's a pattern here in the speech where we can from how the stop begins, we can make some guess about how it's going to end. So whether the person is going to end up being handcuffed or arrested or searched, and the George Floyd stop started, in that same kind of way, with orders. With there's certain sort of linguistic features that are present for stops that are what we call sort of that have escalation involved in them, that aren't present when they don't. So I feel like there are all these ways in which we can see how our perceptions and our actions, even our speech, right, are all influenced by these broader structural issues that we may even be unaware of, but they're still dictating how we interact with one another, dictating how we behave and what we remember, and how we treat one another.
And I'd like to add, I completely agree with everything that you said. I'd like to add that this is not a matter of etiquette and politeness.
Yeah.
This is a matter of life and death.
It is.
And I'm haunted by the case of Jonathan Farrell in North Carolina several years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. This was a young man who just graduated from FAMU. He was very, very popular and well loved on the campus. He had a horrific car accident. That car accident was so bad that he had to crawl out of the back of the car. That's how bad it was. When he got out of the car, he went to get help. He went to the first house that he could get to get help. He knocked on a woman's door. It happened to be an older white woman who responded. It was late at night, so we could put ourselves in her position and see that we would be, surprised. She called the police. The police arrived, and here he was, bloodied, had just come out of a horrific car accident. And their response was to shoot him 11 times, killing him. This is this autonomic, instantaneous, implicit bias of response to the Black body is literally a matter of life and death. There was another case that did not end in death, but I think is an indicator of the disconnect that all too many people who have the luxury of not having to think about this, that there's this disconnect. And so there was a case in Detroit several winters ago during the polar vortex, a video that was taken because it was a dash cam and you could see, I don't know if you remember this case. The officer pulled over a young woman. It was at night. She was coming home from work. It was because it was wintertime, it was very, very dark. And obviously polar vortex meant it was maybe 0 or slightly below 0 degrees, very, very, dangerously cold. And he pulled her over because I think that there was an expired tag, something that's, kind of routine. It's a traffic stop, as you were mentioning.
Right.
And instead of feeling empathy for her, instead of recognizing what this young girl, she was maybe 20, 21, something like that. He forced her, would not permit her to continue to drive. Again, speaking to what you were saying about recognizing the humanity of the individual that's been pulled over. He didn't do that. He didn't recognize her humanity. He forced her to walk all the way home. She just had on like a very light overcoat. And as you're seeing her walk away, he's laughing. I mean, it actually made news in the city of Detroit. He faced consequences for that. But this young woman could have died. I mean, who knew how far she had to go? And on social media, when these things have happened, there will be response from people in what I would call the dominant caste or white citizens who will say, well, when I was stopped by the police, they actually escorted me home. And, someone said I had too much to drink. I'll admit I had too much to drink, this person might say in the comments of something. And they'll say, but they accompanied me home, or they took care, or they cared for me, it cared about me. And so that is what I mean by caste, is that sort of the denial of benefit of the doubt, the denial of basic human kindness and response to an individual on the basis of what they look like. And this and where they're positioned in the hierarchy. And this can literally be a matter of life and death. It's not just about etiquette.
Yeah.
Listening to these stories, I was going to ask a question about this, but I went to the reader or the audience questions, and Tanya Tolson actually is so much more eloquent than I would have asked. So I'm going to go to the audience question right now. How do Ms. Wilkerson and Dr. Eberhardt, particularly as Black women scholars, take care of themselves spiritually, emotionally, and psychologically while researching and writing their comprehensive works on bias and caste?
Well, I would say for myself, there is a way in which the research actually it feels empowering. It's not the opposite. I don't feel like when I'm engaged in it that it's sapping my energy and my spirit, because I feel like I'm sort of learning things and learning and understanding more about society and the human mind and all of these things and it feels like learning things that could be of use to other people and that could actually bring some peace to other people that could, I can tell you a quick story. In writing a book, I interviewed Tiffany Crutcher, who is the twin sister of Terrence Crutcher, who was shot and killed by the police in Tulsa some years ago. His car broke down on the highway, and he captured the attention of police officers, and he was the person, there was a helicopter flying ahead, and the person in the helicopter said, "That's a bad dude." And I don't know if you remember this incident, but he had his hands in the air, and he was walking towards his car, and he was shot and killed. And I ended up, I wrote about that incident, and I wrote about it also from the perspective of a researcher who has done studies in this area, and there have been lots of studies by other researchers that have been done. And so I kind of broke the this whole interaction with the police down in ways of trying to understand how body motion of Black people could be seen as more threatening than a white person who, say, makes the same motion. How the size of Black people is sort of we're seen as, especially Black men, are seen as bigger than they actually are in terms of their weight, and how formidable they are in terms of their height. There's also studies that I've done with researchers where we just expose people to images on a computer screen of, guns or knives. And when we do it so quickly that they don't even see that they've been exposed to these things. And then we show them a face of a Black person and a white person, and we see that their eyes go to the Black person. So there's a way in which you prompt them to think about crime. It directs their vision on sort of what face to look at, who to look at. And so I don't know. So I can go on and on about research too, but I with Tiffany, after the book was published, she read the chapter about her family to her parents, and she said they were in the room together and they cried together. And she said there was a way in which the research brought some relief, there was a way in which they could try to have I don't know, an analysis on what happened that day to their loved one that they didn't have access to before. And she just was so appreciative. And I, at that point too, was still thinking about, science as just delivering information, it's that's the job that it can do. But I feel like data that research can soothe, there's something that is about receiving that information that can soothe the soul. And I feel, grateful and privileged to be in a position to actually do the work that I do. And it doesn't bring me down. It actually, it offers me some purpose in the world to some extent.
Yeah, I would completely agree. This is purpose-driven work. And we embark upon this work because I myself would say I'm on a mission. The mission is to shine a light, to illuminate that which we otherwise might not see. These things are works of synthesis. Tremendous amount of research goes into it. But I would also say that we live in this society, and I can speak for myself. I am descended from people who were survivors of Jim Crow.
Yeah.
I am descended from people who fled the Jim Crow South, defected the Jim Crow South during the Great Migration in hopes that life might be better. And so I live it's in my bones, the things that have occurred to people who look like me, to my ancestors. I mean, this is a part of what I've inherited. And this gives meaning to the work. I mean, the meaning it allows me to tap into, almost in some ways channel all that has gone before me in order to as I said before, I mean, if they could live through this, I certainly can spend the time to do the research of it. Yeah. And it's an honor and a privilege to be able to do it, recognizing that, until the 1960s, well, let me put it this way. The majority of Black people who have ever lived on this soil did not have the chance to be who they could have and should have been able to become. I mean, slavery lasted for 246 years, 12 generations, a quarter of a millennium. Slavery lasted for so long, it won't be until next year, 2022, that the United States will have been a free and independent nation for as long as slavery lasted on this soil. And then, of course, enslavement was followed by another nearly 100 years of Jim Crow regime. So that means that the majority of Black people have never had the chance to even have their stories told, to be able to be the focus of serious research into what their lived experience is truly like. So this is an honor. to be able to do this work. It's my privilege to be able to do this work. I soldier forth now. I actually will listen to music sometimes to help me through it. I listen to Tibetan singing bowls sometimes, and especially with this last book, I was listening to those kinds of things to sort of help me through it. You find ways to be able to get through the more difficult aspects of it. But, to your point, Jennifer, this work can be very powerful. I know the power of this work. And in my case, when it comes to the Warmth of the Suns, one of the unusual and unexpected after effects of it is that I hear from people more than you might expect, who will say to me with a sense of gratitude that this book was the last book that their grandparents or their mother their uncle, the last book that this person read before they left this planet. And they say it with a tremendous sense of gratitude. It's not morbid, it's not macabre, they're not saying it with a sense of sadness, they're saying it with a sense of completion, because many of the people who were survivors of Jim Crow experienced post-traumatic stress. I mean, they were traumatized by what they experienced, and many of them did not speak about what they endured. Once they left, they never looked back. It's often said that people are playing a race card. Well, actually, it's the opposite. For working on Warmth of the Suns, it was not easy to get people to trust and to tell. They were not racing to tell the stories about what they had been through. And so for people to tell me that this is the last book that their loved one read before they left this planet is a tremendous, tremendous honor, because what it did was it validated what they had endured. And that's just one out of many ways that this work can have an impact beyond what we might have otherwise even imagine.
That was really interesting. And I have to say that I commend both of you, because I think your answer to that was something I'm going to draw from, because I just learned a lot listening to you. But, one of the things I think that was the service that you've provided, people hearing the truth, hearing these stories, a lot of times it's just validation, because they've been gaslit for so long that didn't happen. We don't have video of that. That never happened. Those are myth. And by doing the reporting and the work that you've done to prove what the truth really is and what this country was really like, it is relieving to a lot of people. They do get that sense of gratitude and relief from that. So I commend you both for tackling these really difficult subjects sometimes. We have another question from the audience, and this one is from Jennifer Shaw. Do you think that our teacher preparation programs can play a role in how we prepare our next generation of teachers? Should teacher preparation programs be more explicit about centering race and bias, especially when we know that more than 80% of our teachers are white middle-class women? What advice do you have for teacher educators in being part of this change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's one of those questions that people are asking around the country now, school systems around the country, even teaching about slavery. There's a discomfort with that. There's a way in which children don't really understand the horrors of slavery and what it really meant, because sometimes it's taught about in a way that's sort of kind of sanitized, and it's also this worry as you're teaching it, that it could be upsetting for the students in the class, and so there's this concern about, like, what do you do? How do you handle it? There's also just a concern about talking about race at all, about reading texts that have characters in the text that are non-white. So there's a lot, I think, happening there. One of the things that I am a project that I'm working on now is actually trying to understand the role of textbooks in both, potentially producing bias, and then also how it can influence how students are feeling in the classroom. So, for example, I have a colleague at Stanford, Dan Jurafsky, who's a computational linguist, and he worked with a team looking at high school textbooks in Texas, and they were interested in the representations in those. These are all sort of, textbooks that are certified by the state, if you will. And they found that the Black representations seemed to be mostly negative. So when Black people appeared, they were mostly negative. And then also where, they had, they were positioned in a way where they were kind of like what Isabel was talking about, in a lower caste. And whereas with white men, they were seen as agentic, powerful. They were always positive figures in history. And then even though they were in Texas with, I think, 38 or 39% of the Latinx population, there was almost no representation at all of that population in the history books. And so we're now trying to understand, not only sort of how not just trying to look at and sort of, measure the representations that are there using these computational tools, but to try to understand what impact those representations are having on children, on their learning, on their, their sense of belonging, on their spirit, on their performance in the classroom, on their interest in the subject, on their interactions with the teachers, all of this. Because I think textbooks do a lot they teach us in history textbooks, especially teach us about our past, but they could also in some ways be teaching children about who they are now, sort of how their group is seen, who's important, who is powerful, who is deserving, all of these things. So we're trying to understand and unpack all of that.
I again completely agree. And I would say that something that you said, Jennifer, made me think about. You're saying that people can be concerned about the effects on children to be exposed to, the violence that is, that is part and parcel of any discussion of slavery. And then I'm reminded, of course, that there, as you know, and I'm sure we would agree, that there are children who don't have that option. They don't have the luxury of not being aware of the violence that they could face, not aware of the threats that they could face when they go out. I mean, there was a case of a little 8-year-old girl whose story kind of went viral on Instagram, I think it was, where she had a script that her father had taught her. If she were to ever come in contact with a police officer, she was to say, a little 8-year-old girl, Black girl, was to say what her name was, and just to say that I'm not a threat. I will not do you any harm. And she had the script that she was having to deliver. And the fact that any American child has to learn a script, an 8-year-old girl having to learn a script in order in the event that she were to interact with the police officer, that is a tremendous commentary on our society. And if this is the way that any child in our country is forced to live and to try to survive, then that means that we all have a lot of work to do. And it means that our schools have a lot of work to do. Our curriculum needs to reflect that. Teachers have a lot of work to do, but again, parents do. I mean, A lot of times parents will say, some white parents might say to me, what is it that I should be doing to teach my children, or to make sure that my children are not racist, or whatever the term that they're using. And my response is always to do the work yourself, meaning to study, to learn our country's true history, because you can't. How can you train someone else if you yourself do not know that history? And I would say the same would go for teachers or for anyone else. In other words, we all need to know. It's not just about the next generation learning. Of course, that's central and important, but you can't do a good job of it if you yourself do not know our country's history. And I can say, and I know you can say, and Gilbert can say, that our work has shown, and the response to our work has shown, that not enough people know our country's true history. I mean, in recent years, it's not been uncommon to hear someone say I don't recognize my country. This is not my country. This is not what the country stands for. This is not what America stands for. And true, our creed may be different from what we're seeing, but this is our country. And we need to face up to the fact that this is in fact our country. And we need to understand it better if we are going to transcend these barriers and these challenges that we face.
Yeah. Isabel, you bring up a story for me. Is it okay if I tell a story? Is it okay? I don't,
Sure.
I don't know how much time we have, but just in knowing our country, this was about 20 years ago. I was on an airplane, and I found myself sitting next to this man who was white and from South Africa, and he began talking. He was telling me about his life and all of that. And at that point in my life, I'd never met anyone who was white and South African. So I had a lot of questions to ask, including the questions about apartheid. And he looked at me, and I will never forget what he said. He said, I didn't even know what apartheid was growing up. And he grew up in South Africa in the middle of apartheid. And I said, what do you mean? Like, how can you not notice forced segregation and racial unrest and all of these things? And he just said to me, he understood that Black people were poor and they were segregated. So, for example, he knew that the Black woman who cleaned his house every week lived in a poor area. But he told me he didn't understand it as a system of apartheid. And that's because those in power did not have access to the language to describe it. The word apartheid was never used on television. It was never used in the newspaper. He said no one he knew ever spoke of it. And I especially over the last couple years, have just found myself really reflecting on that conversation a lot. Like, I feel like I can understand it now. I can understand what he meant because, the U.S. is in this racial reckoning now, right, where everything's being reexamined and reassessed. And we have these new terms, we have new language, right, to help people to see things that have been right in front of them for their entire lives, but they didn't see it before, right, because they didn't have the words to understand it or to comprehend it. And so anyway, so that conversation is coming up for me, because I just wonder, like, what else don't we see in our own society? Like, what else are we accepting without question? And I just feel like there's so much here. There's so much work we could be doing here to try to, to shine a light in a way that had escaped, this white man from South Africa that I sat next to on the plane that day. It's not just about South Africa. It's about us. It's about us and about our ability to even sort of comprehend and understand, the world that we're living in now.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that from all the questions that are pouring in, we could keep this going all night, but I can't let that happen. But it's just packed, and there's so many good ones there too. But I'm just going to go to Pam McDonald, who sort of sums it up very nicely. She says, I just want to thank you both so much for your work. You are appreciated! ! What's next for you both? If you can talk about that. What's next?
I'm still, this book has been out for a little over a year, and I still am on book tour, you might say, which of course is all virtual, and we are all, there's a screen between all of us, these events that I do, but I'm still very much in the midst of that. Who knew that that we'd be in the midst of a global pandemic when this book came out? Who knew that we would be doing things virtually in the ways that we are? In my case, who knew that this book would have the longevity that it has had? So it has actually kept me going. It turns out that with this book, actually, there are people who are doing their own seminars on this book. I mean, it has its own life, and I'm just trying to keep up with it.
Good luck.
That's funny. So I'm working on two smaller books, which we're calling experiential guides. And so one is about, and they're focused on how to disrupt bias. And so one is disrupting bias that will be written for educators and parents. And then the other is disrupting bias in the workplace. And so been working a bit on that. Also doing a lot of research. I'm the co-director of a center at Stanford called Spark, and we are researchers who work in partnership with practitioners to address significant social problems. And so we have a lot of work that we're doing on police community issues. We have work that we're doing now looking at the media industry and figuring out ways to assist the media industry in using using just all the industry to disrupt bias rather than spread bias. And so we're working on that. A lot of projects around bias in different spaces, basically.
Wow. Well, I just want to say how inspiring both of your work has been to me personally, and I learned so much from your work, and I just want to thank you. This is such a pleasure to meet you both. And I just want to say to the audience, thank you again for joining the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and a special thanks to Isabel Wilkerson and Jennifer Eberhardt for being here tonight. And thanks again to our partner, the New American Colleges and Universities, for their support. We encourage you to follow the Dayton Literary Peace Prize on social media to learn about future Turn the Page conversations, including Ya Jesse, which I mentioned earlier on October 14th. Good night, and thank you for joining us. And thank you to these two brilliant authors for gracing us with their presence and knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.